December 2, 1941, Singapore Naval Base. Japanese naval intelligence officers reviewed reconnaissance photographs with methodical precision, their expressions betraying nothing of the alarm spreading through their calculations. Anchored in the harbor, photographed from maximum altitude to avoid detection, sat HMS Prince of Wales, a King George III-class battleship representing the most modern capital ship design in the Royal Navy. 44,000 tons of steel, armor, and firepower. 10 14-inch guns in an innovative quadruple and twin turret arrangement, the newest fire control systems British engineering could produce, and most significantly, proof that Britain was willing to commit its most valuable naval assets to defend Southeast Asia. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto read the intelligence summaries in Tokyo, with the measured concern of a man who understood what others were celebrating. Yes, Japan's planned offensive would achieve surprise. Yes, Japanese naval aviation had trained for precisely this scenario, but Prince of Wales represented something Japanese planning had hoped to avoid: a modern, heavily armored capital ship with capabilities that could not be dismissed through optimistic assumptions about British weakness or technological inferiority. The battleship that arrived in Singapore carried with it the weight of British naval supremacy. 3 centuries of tradition, suggesting that when Britain sent its newest battleship to Asian waters, it meant business. What Japanese commanders could not know was that Prince of Wales also carried fatal flaws that would transform it from symbol of British power into validation of Japanese naval doctrine within 10 days of war's outbreak. HMS Prince of Wales, commissioned in March 1941, the second King George V-class battleship to enter service. The class represented Britain's response to treaty limitations and modern naval warfare requirements. Ships designed within the 35,000-ton limit imposed by naval treaties, armed with 14-inch guns rather than the 16-inch weapons other navies were adopting, but incorporating the latest British thinking on armor protection, damage control, and fire control systems. Prince of Wales embodied the compromise between treaty compliance and combat effectiveness that characterized British naval construction in the late 1930s. The ship's brief career before deployment to Asia revealed both promise and problems. In May 1941, Prince of Wales engaged the German battleship Bismarck in the Denmark Strait, fighting alongside HMS Hood. The battle exposed critical issues. The ship's main armament experienced mechanical failures during combat, with multiple turrets jamming or becoming inoperable. Hood exploded and sank within minutes, killed by a catastrophic magazine detonation. Prince of Wales, still working up with civilian contractors aboard addressing teething problems, withdrew after taking several hits that penetrated armor and caused significant damage. The engagement was tactically unsuccessful, though Prince of Wales's damage contributed to Bismarck's eventual destruction days later. These problems were known to British Admiralty but considered manageable. New ships always experienced mechanical issues during their first months of service. What mattered was getting a modern capital ship to Singapore to deter Japanese aggression. British strategic thinking assumed that the presence of a battleship, particularly one so modern, would give Japanese planners pause. The Royal Navy had built its reputation on exactly this calculation. Battleships represented such concentrated power that their mere presence could influence enemy strategy without firing a shot. Japanese intelligence gathered every detail available about Prince of Wales. The Denmark Strait action provided valuable data. The ship could be hit, its armor could be penetrated, its weapons experienced reliability problems. But Japanese analysts also noted that Prince of Wales had survived hits from Bismarck's 15-inch guns, hits that would have destroyed lighter vessels. The British battleship was tough, modern, and represented a threat that could not be ignored in any calculation of Pacific naval operations. The decision to deploy Prince of Wales to Singapore in November 1941 represented British confidence in deterrence through presence. Force Z, Prince of Wales, the battlecruiser Repulse, and supporting destroyers, would demonstrate British commitment to defending Malaya and Singapore. The Japanese would see a modern battleship and recalculate the risks of southward expansion. Japanese naval aviation viewed Prince of Wales's deployment with different calculations than surface warfare officers. The Imperial Japanese Navy had spent a decade developing naval aviation to unprecedented levels of capability and doctrine. Japanese carrier pilots were among the best trained in the world, with many veterans having combat experience in China. More critically, Japan had developed the Type 91 aerial torpedo. a weapon specifically designed for shallow water attacks and optimized against heavily armored targets. The theoretical problem of attacking a modern battleship with aircraft had been studied exhaustively. British and American navies largely concluded that battleships with adequate anti-aircraft armament and fighter cover were effectively immune to air attack while underway. Japanese doctrine reached different conclusions. Massed torpedo bomber attacks, carefully coordinated, could overwhelm even the most heavily defended capital ship. The key was numbers, coordination, and accepting casualties to achieve hits. Prince of Wales represented an ideal test case for these competing doctrines. British confidence in battleship invulnerability rested on assumptions about anti-aircraft fire density and fighter protection. Japanese confidence in naval aviation rested on training, weapon development, and tactical coordination, refined through years of preparation. The deployment of a modern British battleship to Southeast Asian waters where Japanese land-based naval aviation could reach it created exactly the scenario Japanese planners had theorized about but never tested against a first-rate opponent. What made Japanese commanders genuinely concerned, however, was not the theoretical vulnerability of battleships to air attack. They believed their own doctrine, but the operational complications Prince of Wales created. If Force Z operated effectively, if it interdicted Japanese invasion convoys heading for Malaya, the carefully timed offensive could be disrupted. Japanese amphibious operations depended on precise timing and overwhelming force at landing points. A modern battleship loose among transport convoys could inflict catastrophic losses before being brought to battle. The window of vulnerability was narrow. Prince of Wales had arrived without adequate air cover. Singapore's air defenses were insufficient. The promised aircraft carrier, HMS Indomitable, had run aground and could not join Force Z for perhaps 2 weeks, until reinforcements arrived or Japanese operations concluded successfully. Prince of Wales would operate in an environment where Japanese land-based aviation could reach it, but British air cover could not adequately protect it. Japanese commanders recognized the opportunity but also the risk. If they failed to neutralize Force Z quickly, if Prince of Wales survived initial attacks and proved as tough as its armor suggested, the entire Malayan operation faced potential disaster. December 8, 1941. Japan's simultaneous attacks across the Pacific commenced within hours of each other. Pearl Harbor, Wake Island, the Philippines, Hong Kong, and Malaya. Force Z received orders to intercept Japanese invasion convoys heading for northern Malaya. Admiral Tom Phillips, commanding Force Z from Prince of Wales, understood the risks, but believed aggressive action was necessary. British prestige in Asia depended on demonstrating that the Royal Navy would fight, that Japan could not operate with impunity in waters Britain considered its sphere of influence. Prince of Wales and Repulse sailed north from Singapore with destroyer escorts, seeking the Japanese invasion force. Japanese reconnaissance aircraft spotted them on December 9th. Admiral Matsunaga Sadaichi, commanding the 22nd Air Flotilla on Saigon airfields in French Indochina, received confirmation that the British battleship was at sea, within range, and unprotected by air cover. He ordered immediate preparations for attack. Every available torpedo bomber and high-altitude bomber would launch in coordinated strikes designed to overwhelm the British ship's defenses. The Japanese pilots briefed for the mission understood they were facing not just any battleship, but one of Britain's newest and most capable. Intelligence briefings emphasized Prince of Wales's heavy armor belt, advanced damage control systems, and dense anti-aircraft armament. The attack plan called for overwhelming numbers, 85 aircraft in the first wave, including 51 torpedo bombers. The doctrine was proven in exercises but never tested against a modern, fully alert battleship underway at sea and taking evasive action. Japanese aircrews approached the mission with professional confidence mixed with respect for their target. Prince of Wales represented the Royal Navy's technological sophistication, fire control systems more advanced than Japanese equivalents, damage control training refined through centuries of naval warfare, armor schemes designed to resist torpedo hits. If the British battleship's anti-aircraft fire was as effective as specifications suggested, if its armor held against torpedo strikes as designed, Japanese casualties could be severe and results uncertain. Lieutenant Commander Nakanishi Iki, leading the torpedo bomber formation, briefed his pilots with characteristic Japanese thoroughness. The British battleship is a fortress afloat. Our torpedoes must strike below the armor belt In coordinated salvos that prevent effective evasion, individual attacks will fail. The ship's armor is too strong, its defenses too capable. We succeed through coordination, or we fail through piecemeal assault and achieve nothing but our own destruction. The briefing's tone reflected genuine respect for the opponent. This was not the poorly defended merchantman of China, but the Royal Navy's newest weapon deployed specifically to stop Japan's offensive. December 10, 1941, morning. Force Z turned back toward Singapore. The mission aborted after failing to locate the invasion force and receiving warnings that Japanese air attacks were imminent. Admiral Phillips believed he could reach Singapore's air cover range before Japanese aircraft found him. The calculation proved fatally optimistic. At 1100 hours, Japanese reconnaissance aircraft spotted Force Z. At 1113 hours, the first wave of Japanese bombers appeared. The Japanese attack unfolded with the precision of forces that had trained for exactly this scenario. High-altitude bombers struck first, forcing Prince of Wales to maneuver, disrupting anti-aircraft fire patterns. Then torpedo bombers came in waves from multiple directions, exploiting the battleship's inability to turn quickly enough to present narrow profiles to all attacking directions simultaneously. The coordination was exceptional. While Prince of Wales's anti-aircraft guns engaged bombers from one quarter, torpedo bombers attacked from another. The first torpedo struck Prince of Wales's port side near the stern at 1144 hours. The hit was catastrophic beyond the simple matter of hull penetration. The torpedo struck near the propeller shaft, and the explosion's shock traveled up the shaft into the ship's interior, damaging machinery spaces and, critically, destroying watertight integrity in compartments the armor belt didn't protect. Water flooded into spaces that weren't designed to contain it. Worse, the shaft damage affected steering. Prince of Wales began listing and losing maneuverability exactly when maneuverability meant survival. Japanese pilots observed the hit's effects with professional satisfaction, mixed with surprise at how effective it had been. The British battleship, moments ago maneuvering aggressively and filling the sky with anti-aircraft fire, was suddenly sluggish, listing, vulnerable. Subsequent attacks pressed home with increased confidence. More torpedoes struck. 8 hits total on Prince of Wales, though some accounts suggest different numbers depending on what counted as a hit versus a near miss. What stunned Japanese aircrew was not that they damaged Prince of Wales, their doctrine predicted that, but how quickly the damage accumulated into a death sentence. The battleship's armor had done its job against some hits, the belt deflecting or containing explosions. But the coordination of attacks, the overwhelming numbers, the critical hit to the stern's vulnerable areas, these overwhelmed even modern damage control. By 1220 hours, Prince of Wales was clearly doomed, settling deeper in the water, listing beyond recovery, her crew preparing to abandon ship. The battleship capsized and sank at 1318 hours, taking Admiral Phillips and 326 men with her. Repulse had sunk earlier. Japanese aircraft losses. 3 planes. The arithmetic was devastating. The immediate Japanese reaction combined triumph with sober assessment. They had sunk a modern British battleship and a battlecruiser in a single action, validating years of doctrine development and training. But the post-action analysis revealed how narrow the victory margins had been and what it suggested about future operations against heavily defended targets. Commander Nakanishi's after-action report noted critical factors. Prince of Wales' anti-aircraft fire was intense and accurate, more effective than intelligence suggested. Our success depended on overwhelming numbers attacking simultaneously from multiple vectors. Smaller formations would have been defeated with heavy losses and minimal results. The British battleship's armor withstood several torpedo hits. Penetrations occurred primarily in areas outside the main belt or through cumulative structural damage. A smaller attack force, or one lacking coordination, would have failed. The report's implications troubled Japanese naval aviation planners. Prince of Wales had been caught in nearly ideal circumstances. No air cover, no friendly forces nearby, operating in waters where Japanese land-based aviation could concentrate overwhelming strength. Yet even under these conditions, neutralizing the British battleship required 85 aircraft and came dangerously close to failure before the critical stern hit crippled its mobility. What would happen when facing multiple modern battleships with fighter cover and operating in mutual support? More concerning were the resource implications. The 22nd Air Flotilla, had committed essentially its entire strike capability to sink Force Z. Those aircraft and crews were now unavailable for supporting amphibious operations, covering convoys, or responding to other threats. If Britain had deployed 3 modern battleships instead of 1, if they operated dispersed rather than concentrated, could Japanese naval aviation have engaged all of them simultaneously? The mathematics suggested not. Japan's advantage in naval aviation, while real, was not infinite. Intelligence analysis of Prince of Wales's final moments revealed additional concerning data. Despite catastrophic damage, the battleship had remained operational for over 2 hours after the first critical hit. Damage control parties had fought the flooding, maintained some propulsion, kept guns firing. Even while sinking, Prince of Wales anti-aircraft guns had continued engaging aircraft. The ship's toughness, its ability to absorb punishment and continue fighting, had been impressive. A tougher opponent, a more experienced crew perhaps, or a battleship with slightly different armor distribution, might have survived long enough for Singapore-based aircraft to arrive. Japanese commanders celebrating the victory privately acknowledged the uncomfortable truth. They had faced a modern British battleship in optimal conditions and barely won. Future battles might not offer such advantages. The sinking's psychological impact rippled through both navies with seismic force. For the Royal Navy, the loss shattered assumptions that had governed British naval thinking for decades. Battleships had been considered effectively immune to air attack while underway and actively defending themselves. Prince of Wales' destruction proved that assumption catastrophically wrong. More painfully, the battleship had been Britain's newest, most modern capital ship. If Prince of Wales could be sunk by aircraft, every battleship in the Royal Navy was vulnerable. British Admiralty immediately reassessed Pacific strategy. Plans that assumed battleship presence would deter Japanese aggression collapsed. Force Z's destruction meant Singapore was indefensible without air superiority, which Britain could not provide. The entire architecture of British power in Asia, built on the assumption that Royal Navy capital ships commanded respect and provided strategic flexibility, suddenly looked fragile. Churchill later wrote that the news of Prince of Wales sinking was among the worst shocks of the war, worse in its strategic implications than many larger disasters. For Japanese commanders, victory brought validation, but also gnawing concerns. They had proven their doctrine worked, but at what cost for future operations? The 22nd Air Flotilla had trained for years specifically for this mission. Their pilots were exceptionally skilled, their coordination superb, their weapons optimized. Could other Japanese air units replicate these results? More importantly, what happened when facing American battleships with better anti-aircraft armament and fighter protection? The tactical lessons were studied obsessively. Japanese analysts noted that Prince of Wales's anti-aircraft fire had been more effective than expected. Several aircraft damaged, some forced to break off attacks, coordination disrupted by the sheer volume of fire. If the British had possessed another half-dozen modern battleships in the area, could Japanese aviation have engaged them all simultaneously? The analysis suggested disturbing answers. Japan's numerical advantage in naval aviation was real, but not overwhelming, and it depended on concentrating forces against isolated targets. What particularly concerned thoughtful Japanese officers was the logistics of the victory. Sinking Force Z required land-based aircraft operating from Saigon airfields, aircraft that needed fuel, ordnance, maintenance, and replacement parts. Japanese logistics, while adequate for current operations, were stretched thin across expanding Pacific commitments. Every aircraft committed to sinking battleships was an aircraft unavailable for supporting ground operations, protecting convoys, or conducting reconnaissance. The victory over Prince of Wales was operationally significant, but strategically expensive in ways that didn't appear in casualty reports. Admiral Yamamoto, reviewing the action from Tokyo, recognized the victory's limitations. Japan had caught a modern British battleship in ideal circumstances and destroyed it, but the cost in resources, the concentration of force required, suggested that Japan's window of advantage in the Pacific was narrower than optimistic assessments suggested. The strategic implications unfolded through December 1941 and into early 1942. With Force Z destroyed, Singapore's naval defense collapsed. Japanese amphibious operations proceeded without the interdiction threat that Prince of Wales had represented. British, Indian, and Australian forces in Malaya fought without naval support. their positions becoming increasingly untenable as Japanese forces advanced down the peninsula. Singapore fell on February 15, 1942, a disaster of historic proportions, surrendering 80,000 troops and shattering British prestige throughout Asia. American naval planners studied the Prince of Wales sinking with intense focus and growing alarm. If a modern British battleship could be destroyed so quickly by land-based aircraft, what did that suggest about American battleships operating in the Pacific? The U.S. Navy possessed numerical advantages over Japan, but those advantages meant nothing if battleships could not survive in waters where Japanese land-based aviation operated. The traditional doctrine of battleship supremacy, which had governed naval construction and strategy for decades, suddenly looked dangerously obsolete. Japanese propaganda exploited the victory mercilessly. Radio broadcasts to Asian populations emphasized that Japan had destroyed Britain's newest battleship in a single action, proving that Western technological superiority was a myth. The message resonated across colonial Asia. If Britain's most modern warship could be sunk in hours, how could Britain defend its empire? The propaganda's effectiveness multiplied Prince of Wales's tactical significance into strategic psychological warfare. Within the Imperial Japanese Navy, however, more complex assessments emerged. Staff officers reviewing the action noted concerning patterns. Yes, land-based aviation had destroyed a modern battleship, but doing so required concentrating nearly all available strike aircraft from the 22nd Air Flotilla, executing a near-perfect coordinated attack, and catching the target without fighter cover or friendly support. These conditions would not repeat reliably. Future battles against American forces would face better organized defenses, more numerous fighters, and targets that could provide mutual support. The resource calculations particularly troubled logistics officers. Japan had begun the war with numerical advantages in aircraft and trained pilots, but those advantages were finite. Every pilot lost in action was increasingly difficult to replace. Japanese training programs, while excellent, could not match American industrial capacity for producing replacement aircrew. The 22nd Air Flotilla had lost only 3 aircraft, sinking Force Z, but operational attrition, maintenance failures, and combat damage were steadily depleting Japan's initial advantages. Each victory that consumed aircraft and exhausted aircrews brought Japan closer to the point where numerical advantages disappeared and American industrial might began to dominate. The Prince of Wales sinking was a tactical victory and strategic warning, though Japanese commanders celebrating the triumph did not yet fully grasp the warning's implications. The convergence of Prince of Wales's destruction with Pearl Harbor's aftermath created a complex strategic situation that Japanese planners found both encouraging and troubling. At Pearl Harbor, Japanese aircraft had caught American battleships in port, achieving devastating results. Off Malaya, Japanese aircraft had caught a modern battleship at sea. Together, these victories seemed to validate Japanese naval aviation doctrine completely. Battleships, whether in port or underway, could be destroyed by aircraft if attacked with sufficient numbers and coordination, but the circumstances differed in ways that mattered. At Pearl Harbor, American battleships had been moored, unprepared, with minimal anti-aircraft defense and no possibility of evasion. Prince of Wales had been underway, fully alert, maneuvering actively with all anti-aircraft guns operational. The fact that Japanese aviation had destroyed it anyway seemed to prove that battleships were simply obsolete, that the era of the capital ship had ended, replaced by the aircraft carrier as the decisive naval weapon. This conclusion, while superficially correct, masked dangerous oversimplifications. Prince of Wales had sunk due to a combination of factors: lack of fighter cover, isolation from supporting forces, operation within range of land-based aviation, and critically, the lucky hit that damaged steering and propulsion. Remove any single factor, provide fighter cover, operate with supporting battleships, stay beyond range of land-based aircraft, and the outcome might have been dramatically different. Japanese success depended on multiple advantages aligning simultaneously. American naval commanders studying both actions recognized patterns that Japanese assessments sometimes overlooked. Battleships were vulnerable to massed air attack, but only under specific conditions. With adequate fighter cover, with air superiority, with supporting ships providing overlapping anti-aircraft fire, battleships remained formidable weapons. The challenge was ensuring those conditions existed before committing capital ships to action. The U.S. Navy's solution would be to build carrier groups with battleships in supporting roles, protected by umbrella of fighter aircraft, and operating with overwhelming force. Japanese naval aviation, meanwhile, faced the challenge of replicating December 1941's successes under less favorable conditions. As American forces reorganized, as fighter strength increased, as doctrine evolved to protect capital ships with layered defenses, the conditions that allowed Force Z's destruction became increasingly rare. Japanese pilots would face better defended targets, more numerous fighters, and opponents who had learned from British mistakes. The irony was that Prince of Wales's destruction, while tactically devastating for Britain, provided strategic lessons that ultimately benefited the Allies. American commanders learned to never operate battleships without air cover, to never allow capital ships to be caught isolated, to always ensure fighter protection. Japanese commanders, flush with victory, sometimes drew overly optimistic conclusions about naval aviation's capabilities against well-defended opponents. By mid-1942, the strategic implications of Prince of Wales's sinking had fully matured. The Royal Navy had withdrawn surviving capital ships from areas where Japanese land-based aviation could reach them, effectively ceding control of Southeast Asian waters. American strategy in the Pacific increasingly centered on carrier operations, with battleships relegated to shore bombardment and anti-aircraft support rather than independent operations. The age of the battleship as the dominant naval weapon had ended, and Prince of Wales's destruction had been the clearest demonstration of that fact. For Japanese forces, the victory's legacy proved more complicated than initial celebration suggested. The doctrine validated by sinking Prince of Wales, that massed aerial torpedo attacks could destroy modern battleships, worked brilliantly when conditions were favorable. But creating favorable conditions grew increasingly difficult as Allied forces adapted. By the Battle of Midway in June 1942, American carriers operated with fighter screens, radar warning systems, and doctrine specifically designed to prevent the kind of isolated vulnerability that had doomed Force Z. Japanese casualties among naval aviation crews began mounting. The pilots who had sunk Prince of Wales, highly trained, exceptionally skilled, experienced in coordinated attacks, were irreplaceable. Each action, whether victory or defeat, depleted Japan's pool of expert air crews. American training programs, though producing initially less skilled pilots, operated on industrial scale that Japanese programs could not match. By late 1942, Japanese naval aviation was beginning the long decline from qualitative superiority toward quantitative inferiority that would doom Japanese Pacific operations. The operational lessons from Prince of Wales's sinking influenced both sides' tactical evolution. Japanese forces continued seeking opportunities to catch Allied capital ships in vulnerable positions, but such opportunities became rare as Allied doctrine evolved. American and British forces developed elaborate procedures for protecting battleships, never operating them beyond fighter range, always ensuring air superiority, coordinating movements with carrier groups to provide mutual support. These procedures proved effective but also revealed a fundamental shift. Battleships had transformed from independent weapons capable of strategic effect into valuable but vulnerable assets requiring protection. The psychological dimension persisted longest. Japanese propaganda continued referencing Prince of Wales's destruction as proof of Japanese superiority, even as strategic reality shifted toward Allied advantage. For British forces, the loss remained a painful memory that symbolized the Empire's declining ability to defend its Asian possessions. The battleship that had sailed to Singapore as symbol of British power had become, through its destruction, symbol of British vulnerability and the end of an era in naval warfare. The final months of 1942 brought clarity to questions posed by Prince of Wales's sinking. At the Battle of the Eastern Solomons in August and Santa Cruz in October, Japanese naval aviation faced American carrier forces protected by strong fighter screens and elaborate anti-aircraft defenses. The results contrasted sharply with December 1941. Japanese attacks achieved some successes, but at crushing cost. Skilled aircrew lost in numbers. Japanese training programs could not replace, attacking targets far better defended than Force Z had been. American battleships, now operating within carrier task forces and protected by layers of fighters and screening ships, proved far more resilient than Prince of Wales had been in isolation. Japanese torpedo bomber formations attempting the coordinated attacks that had destroyed Force Z found themselves shredded by American fighters long before reaching attack positions. When attacks did reach American battleships, overlapping anti-aircraft fire from multiple ships created defensive firepower density that Force Z's two capital ships could not have matched. The mathematical advantage that had allowed 85 aircraft to overwhelm Prince of Wales's defenses disappeared when American task forces routinely operated with fighter screens of 50 100 aircraft and battleship groups that could mask the anti-aircraft firepower of 6 or more capital ships. Japanese aviation's qualitative advantages, superior training, better coordination, more experienced crews, were being ground down by American quantitative advantages in aircraft production, pilot training capacity, and logistical depth. By early 1943, Japanese naval commanders privately acknowledged that the conditions that had allowed Force Z's destruction could not be reliably recreated. American battleships would not venture within range of land-based aviation without carrier support. American carriers would not operate without fighter screens that outnumbered available Japanese attack aircraft. Most critically, American industrial production was replacing losses faster than Japanese forces could inflict them, while Japanese losses, particularly in trained aircrew, were becoming irreplaceable. The doctrine validated by sinking Prince of Wales remained theoretically sound. Massed torpedo attacks could destroy modern battleships if executed with sufficient numbers and coordination against isolated targets. But the operational requirements for creating those conditions, numerical superiority in attack aircraft, absence of enemy fighter cover, target isolation from supporting forces, were no longer achievable. Japanese naval aviation had proven its doctrine worked in December 1941. By December 1942, American adaptation and industrial strength had rendered that doctrine obsolete through sheer weight of defensive capability. Prince of Wales' destruction had taught both sides critical lessons. The side that learned faster and adapted more effectively was winning the war. The war's final years saw Prince of Wales' legacy crystallize into doctrinal certainties. Battleships never again operated independently in areas where hostile aviation could reach them. The Royal Navy rebuilt its Eastern Fleet but organized it around carriers with battleships in support roles. The U.S. Navy's Pacific advances relied on carrier task forces, where battleships provided anti-aircraft firepower and shore bombardment, but never ventured forward independently. The lesson of Force Z had been learned completely. Capital ships without air superiority were doomed. For Japanese forces, the ironies multiplied painfully. The naval aviation that had destroyed Prince of Wales in December 1941, demonstrating Japanese technological and tactical superiority, had been systematically destroyed by late 1944. American fighters shot down the expert pilots. American industrial production replaced losses Japan could not match. American radar and tactics neutralized the coordination advantages Japanese crews had demonstrated off Malaya. The weapon that had won Japan's greatest naval victory became the victim of the strategic forces that victory helped unleash. Japanese battleships, built according to doctrines that Prince of Wales' destruction had supposedly rendered obsolete, spent most of the war hiding in port or fleeing American carrier forces. The super battleships Yamato and Musashi, more heavily armed and armored than Prince of Wales could ever have been, proved as vulnerable to massed air attack as the British ship. Musashi sank under torpedo and bomb hits in October 1944, absorbing even more punishment than Prince of Wales, but succumbing eventually to the same arithmetic of overwhelming attack numbers. Yamato died on a suicide mission in April 1945, destroyed by American carrier aircraft in the same manner Japanese carrier aircraft had destroyed Force Z. The strategic cycle had completed itself. Japan had proven battleships were vulnerable to naval aviation, then watched as American naval aviation, better equipped, more numerous, supported by industrial capacity Japan could not match, applied those same lessons against Japanese battleships. The doctrine that destroyed Prince of Wales ultimately destroyed the Japanese surface fleet, wielded by opponents who had learned from British mistakes and possessed resources that made those lessons devastatingly effective. By war's end, surviving naval officers on both sides understood that December 10, 1941, had marked more than the loss of a single battleship. Prince of Wales's destruction had been the visible symbol of a fundamental shift in naval warfare, from battleship supremacy to carrier dominance, from armor and guns to aircraft and torpedoes, from an era where capital ships operated independently to one where they survived only under protective air cover. The battleship that sailed to Singapore to demonstrate British power had instead demonstrated that the era of battleship power was ending. December 10, 1944, Tokyo. Admiral Yamamoto's former chief of staff stood before a map showing American carrier task forces approaching the Philippines. 3 years to the day since Prince of Wales sank off Malaya. The strategic situation had inverted completely. Where once Japanese naval aviation had caught a British battleship without fighter cover, now American naval aviation hunted Japanese battleships with overwhelming fighter superiority. Where once 85 Japanese aircraft had overwhelmed British defenses, now American task forces could launch strikes of 300-plus aircraft against targets that could no longer adequately defend themselves. He thought about the lessons of that December day in 1941. Japanese victory had seemed to prove decisive technological and tactical superiority. The coordination, the training, the weapons, all had worked exactly as doctrine predicted. Prince of Wales had sunk, British naval power in Asia had collapsed, and Japan's offensive had proceeded without serious naval opposition. The victory had been complete, professional, devastating. But victory had taught Japanese forces the wrong lessons. Or rather, they had learned correct lessons that were immediately obsoleted by American adaptation and industrial response. Yes, massed torpedo attacks could sink modern battleships, but executing those attacks required numerical advantages Japan no longer possessed, against targets far more vulnerable than American forces now fielded. Under conditions of air superiority Japan could no longer achieve. The staff officer pulled out a photograph from December 10, 1941. Prince of Wales under attack. Japanese aircraft swarming around the stricken battleship, the water white with torpedo wakes. The image had been distributed widely in Japan as proof of victory, of technological superiority, of tactical excellence. All true, in that moment. All irrelevant 3 years later as American industrial might ground down every advantage Japan had possessed in December 1941. "We feared Prince of Wales," he said quietly to a junior officer reviewing the same charts. "We feared it because it represented British naval power, centuries of tradition, modern technology, professional competence. We proved we could sink it, and that proof gave us confidence to expand further. But in sinking it, we taught the British and Americans what they needed to survive, and they learned faster than we could adapt." The junior officer looked at the photograph, then at the map showing American task forces. "We won that battle," he observed. "Why are we losing the war?" The staff officer set down the photograph. "Because we proved our doctrine against the last generation of naval warfare while our enemies were building the next." HMS Prince of Wales rests in 223 feet of water off Kuantan, Malaysia, a war grave protected by law, visited by divers who see the massive hull broken but largely intact, turrets still in place, the structure that should have protected it from any conventional threat now monument to warfare's evolution. The battleship that survived Bismarck's guns could not survive the weapon of the future arriving 3 years before anyone thought the future would come. Military historians debate whether Prince of Wales' deployment to Singapore was strategic error or unavoidable necessity. Britain needed to demonstrate commitment to Asian defense, needed to deter Japanese aggression, needed to prove that British naval power remained relevant. The battleship represented all of those things, until it didn't, until Japanese torpedoes proved that even modern capital ships were vulnerable to properly executed aerial attack. The defeat was tactical, strategic, and symbolic simultaneously. Japanese commanders feared Prince of Wales because it represented Britain's latest thinking on naval warfare. Modern fire control, heavy armor, sophisticated damage control. That fear proved well-founded. Even when sinking, Prince of Wales had been tough, dangerous, difficult to destroy. But the fear also blinded Japanese planners to what Prince of Wales's destruction revealed: that the advantage in naval aviation Japan possessed in December 1941 was temporary, based on specific circumstances that American industrial strength and tactical adaptation would eliminate within 18 months. The British feared losing Prince of Wales because it symbolized their naval supremacy's end. The Japanese feared facing it because it represented modern naval power they had to defeat to proceed with their offensive. Both fears proved justified, but the significance differed from what either side expected. Prince of Wales's destruction did not prove Japanese superiority. It proved that naval warfare had fundamentally changed, that the era both sides had prepared for was already over, and that the war would be won by whoever adapted fastest to the new reality. 83 years later, the wreck serves as memorial to 840 men who died, British sailors, Royal Marines, Admiral Phillips, and as reminder of how quickly military certainties can be overturned. The battleship that should have deterred war became war's victim. The weapon designed to control seas became victim of control of air. Japanese commanders had feared it rightly, then destroyed it completely, and in destroying it demonstrated principles that would eventually destroy Japanese naval power just as thoroughly. The fear was justified. The victory was real. The strategic conclusions both sides drew proved tragically wrong for different reasons, and thousands would die learning the correct lessons written in Prince of Wales' wreckage beneath Pacific waters.